Okay, so are you ready to dive into some seriously intense material today? We're talking societal collapse.
Yeah, and you weren't kidding about intense. This is quite the collection of sources you've brought to the table.
No sugarcoating today, that's for sure. We're jumping right into the deep end with this deep dive.
We've got an interview with Pablo Servigne. He was on that French YouTube channel, Thinkerview, right?
Right, and then to really round things out, excerpts from Welcome to the Great Unraveling and Deep Adaptation, a map for navigating climate tragedy.
Phew. Yeah, so where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, I guess the elephant in the room is, are these sources saying societal collapse is a done deal? Like, is that it? Is that the future?
Well, it's not a simple yes or no.
Okay, so it's complicated.
Yeah, both of the reports, they say that, the choices we make right now, today, they're super critical.
Makes sense.
But, they also say the future isn't, already written. We still have some say in this.
Okay, so there's still hope.
Yeah, for sure. But welcome to the Great Unraveling. They introduce this, well, kind of scary concept. They call if the Great Acceleration.
The Great Acceleration. All right, so unpack that for us a little. What is that exactly?
So think about the 20th century, especially the second half, right?
Yeah.
We saw this insane surge in human activity everywhere. And a lot of it was because of, well, us relying so much on fossil
Oh,
fuels.
fuels, right.
Yeah, so that led to industrialization happening super fast, and suddenly, everything ramped up, population growth, how much everyone was consuming, we hit the gas pedal and forgot where the brakes were.
And these reports are saying that this great acceleration is what's pushing us toward, like, the cliff of collapse.
Exactly. Welcome to the Great Unraveling uses another term. They call it a polycrisis.
A polycrisis. What does that even mean?
It means that all these different environmental and social crises, they're all tangled up together, they're feeding each other.
So it's not just climate change.
Oh, it's way bigger than just climate change. It's like global warming is a huge part of it, but it's also we're losing biodiversity like crazy, and all our resources are being used up.
Resources, right? Like what kinds of resources? Give us some examples.
Well, you name it. Soil, the ground we need to grow things, water, we're using up clean water way too fast, even stuff like chemical pollution.
It's like we're pulling on a loose thread on a sweater, and the whole thing is just unraveling.
Fantastic.
Welcome to the Great Unraveling. Mentions this success story from back in the 80s. They fixed the hole in the ozone layer. Remember that?
Yeah.
So if we can fix big environmental problems, why does it seem like we're failing so badly now?
Well, here's the thing. There are all these social and systemic factors that come into play.
Social and systemic. Okay, break that down a little.
The report argues that our whole global system, the way we've set everything up, it's actually incredibly fragile.
Fragile how?
Think about the COVID pandemic. It showed us just how interconnected and vulnerable everything is. One disruption, and it can be anywhere in the world, and boom, suddenly there are shortages, delays, everything gets thrown off.
Right, and people freak out.
Exactly. And when resources are scarce, that's when things can get, well, messy, unrest.
Yeah. And you mentioned that money plays a part in this too, right?
Huge part. Both reports talk about this. Welcome to the Great Unraveling. They highlight this gap between the super rich and, well, everyone else. It's alarming how much wealth and power a tiny percentage of the population controls.
And that just makes all these other problems even worse.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
Which leads us to another thing that makes all of this so complicated.
Yeah.
How do we even begin to wrap our heads around the possibility of societal collapse? Deep Adaptation spends a lot of time talking about this, about why it's so hard for us to face.
Yeah, it's a lot to process. They call it interpretive denial. Basically, we acknowledge the facts, but we downplay them.
So it's like, yeah, climate change is real, but it won't be that bad.
Right. Or we tell ourselves, oh, technology will fix it. That's what they call implicative denial. We distract ourselves with solutions that sound good, but don't actually solve the real root problems.
It's easier to focus on a quick fix than to deal with the fact that the whole system might be broken.
Exactly. And, that interview with Pablo Servigne that you mentioned, he brings up this whole other side to it with the whole Cassandra predicament.
Cassandra, like the Greek myth.
Yeah, exactly. So he's saying that people who are speaking out about this, about collapse, they often face a ton of pushback.
Because no one wants to hear it.
Right. It's classic shoot the messenger. Bad news, especially when it challenges everything we thought we knew about the future, progress, all that. It's easier to just ignore it.
And especially if those warnings come with solutions that require big changes, like rethinking this whole idea of endless economic growth, right?
Absolutely. It's like asking people to question the very foundation of how our society is structured.
And the people in power, they benefit from the way things are, so they're not going to be lining up to change things, even if it means we're headed for disaster.
Exactly. So understanding this whole psychology of denial, it helps to explain why it's so difficult to make the changes we need to make, even when all the evidence is staring us right in the face.
So let's talk about this potential collapse a little more. What would that even look like? Are we talking like Mad Max scenarios?
That's actually something that Servigne addresses directly in the interview. He even mentions those kinds of movies, Mad Max, Gorilla. He's saying that using a word like collapse, it kind of cuts through all the noise, it gets people's attention.
Definitely a powerful word.
But he also says that it's more nuanced than just the typical like post-apocalyptic images we often see. He uses this phrase, crises of cardiac coherence.
Crises of cardiac coherence. Okay, I'll be honest, I've never heard that one before.
So think about it like a societal heart attack, a sudden shock to the system that throws everything into chaos.
Okay, I get it. And he gives an example of this, right?
He does. He talks about this trucker strike in the UK that happened back in 2000.
A trucker strike?
Yeah.
Okay, so how does that demonstrate a societal heart attack?
Well, only 150 truckers went on strike. That's all it took. But within days, the whole country was in chaos.
Wow, really? Just from some truckers going on strike?
Hospitals had to cancel surgeries, businesses went bankrupt, schools had to shut down, all because, well, our systems are so interconnected. We rely on things being delivered just in time, and when they're not.
The system can't handle it.
Exactly.
It makes you realize how fragile everything really is. Like, we've built this whole way of life that depends on everything running smoothly, but we've never really considered what happens when it doesn't.
Exactly. And Servigne, he talks about this idea of heteronomy. It's like we've become so reliant on these external systems to take care of our needs.
We can't take care of ourselves anymore.
Well, it's more like we've forgotten how to think about it. Our grandparents, they used to have like a 2-month supply of food at home, just in case.
Right, they were prepared for anything.
Exactly. But today we're so used to just going to the store and getting whatever we need whenever we need it. We've lost that sense of self-sufficiency.
It's like we've outsourced our resilience. And now if something happens, if the supply chains break down, if resources become scarce, it's easy to imagine people freaking out.
It's easy to imagine those Black Friday Nutella riots.
Exactly. Everyone fighting over the last jar. It's like this primal instinct takes over.
Actually, Servigne would argue that those Black Friday frenzies, they're not really about primal instinct.
They're not.
He calls it the Nutella effect. It's more about our consumerist culture, this idea that we always need more stuff.
So it's not really how we act in a crisis. It's more like how we act when we're told we can't have something.
Exactly. He says it's important to look at how people actually behave in real crises, like natural disasters or terrorist attacks. He talks about this book, A Paradise Built in Hell.
And what does it say? What happens when things really hit the fan?
Well, it turns out that in those situations, the most common response is actually altruism.
Altruism. People helping each other.
Yeah. People instinctively reach out to help strangers. Communities come together to support one another.
Wow. That's not really the picture we usually see, is it?
Not at all. And Servigne, he even points to 9/11 as an example.
Really?
Right after the attacks, there was this outpouring of compassion and solidarity. People helping each other, donating blood, volunteering their time. It was a powerful example of how, in the face of tragedy, we can come together and support one another.
That is pretty amazing when you think about it.
And Servigne, he argues that scarcity doesn't have to lead to violence.
But we always hear that it does.
He says it's the culture we bring into those situations that matters most. If we believe that our neighbors are going to steal from us, then yeah, we're more likely to act defensively, even aggressively.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. Our beliefs shape our actions.
So if it's not human nature, then where does this culture of egoism come from?
Servigne believes that our detachment from nature plays a big role. This idea that we're somehow separate from the natural world.
That we're above it all.
Right. And that allows us to exploit both the planet and each other without fully grasping the consequences.
And that's definitely not sustainable.
Not at all. And this ties back into deep adaptation and their emphasis on shifting from exploitation to collective care.
Recognizing that we're all connected.
Exactly. And here's where Servigne offers a really interesting perspective. He suggests that the climate crisis, as dire as it is, could actually become a catalyst for greater global cooperation.
Right. So a common enemy brings us together.
Think about it. A shared threat, it can unite people, create a sense of solidarity and shared purpose. And he believes that climate change could be that unifying force on a global scale.
That's a pretty optimistic view.
Well, deep adaptation acknowledges that it won't be easy. We need to address things like inequality, rebuild trust, create systems that allow for effective collaboration.
So it's not just about coming together against a common enemy. It's about dismantling the systems that divide us in the first place.
Right, and that's why Servigne emphasizes the importance of building resilience at a local level within our communities.
He talks about working with his local council, building relationships with his neighbors, right?
Exactly. He sees that local level organization as crucial for navigating disruptions, no matter how big or small they are.
So while the big picture might feel overwhelming, there are things we can do right here, right now, to prepare ourselves in our communities.
Absolutely. And Welcome to the Great Unraveling gives some practical examples of what this might look like. Things like localizing food systems, prioritizing energy conservation, exploring alternative currencies.
It's basically becoming less reliant on those fragile global systems.
Exactly. And deep adaptation reminds us that preparedness isn't just about physical resources.
Right. It's about our mental and emotional state, too.
They talk about nurturing community connections, self-care practices, emotional regulation skills.
Building our inner resilience.
Exactly. And Servigne, he takes it a step further. He talks about the importance of becoming comfortable with death and grief. He even suggests spending time in palliative care units.
Wow. That's intense.
It is. But it speaks to this need for a major shift in perspective. We need to move from denying death and the planet's limits to embracing them as part of the natural cycle of life.
So we're talking about a major perspective shift. But amidst all this talk of prepping for collapse, it makes you wonder, what are we even prepping for? What does the other side of this look like?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Is there even an answer to that?
Well, there's no crystal ball. But Servigne and those reports, they offer some interesting ideas.
Okay, so indulge us. What does a post-collapse world look like?
Servigne uses this metaphor. He compares it to, like, a forest. Imagine a huge tree falling, right?
Okay, I'm picturing it.
It creates this clearing, this open space where the sun can suddenly reach the forest floor. It seems like a bad thing at first, but that space allows new life to grow.
So we're not talking total wasteland. We're talking more like the collapse of the old makes way for the new.
Exactly. It's a chance to rethink everything, to figure out what actually matters and rebuild based on, like, cooperation, equality, sustainability.
That actually sounds kind of hopeful.
It is hopeful, but welcome to the Great Unraveling. They're also realistic. They don't pretend it's going to be easy.
Right, because it's one thing to say, oh, new life will grow, but how do we actually make sure that happens?
They say that getting our response right, it's not just about avoiding collapse, it's about what we do after.
So what do we do?
We have to shift away from this whole paradigm of exploitation.
Exploitation. We talk about that a lot. But what does it actually mean in this context?
It means we stop taking resources just because we can, just because it benefits a few people. We have to start thinking about equitable distribution, making sure everyone has what they need, and regeneration, making sure we're giving back to the planet instead of just taking.
So instead of asking, what can I get? It's what can I give?
Exactly. And that's not just good for the planet, it's good for us, for our well-being.
It's a total value shift. From me to we, from scarcity to abundance.
And welcome to the Great Unraveling. They say this shift is essential. It's the only way to create a future that's not just sustainable, but also fair and just.
So, okay, it's going to be rough. It might even be chaotic for a while. But there's also this possibility that we come out stronger, that we learn from our mistakes and create something truly amazing.
It's a possibility, but it's going to take effort. It's going to take all of us working together, and we have to be okay with not knowing all the answers.
It's more about asking the right questions.
Exactly. Which brings us back to deep adaptation and those 4 Rs they talk about. Remember?
Resilience, relinquishment, restoration, reconciliation.
They're like guideposts for navigating this whole transition.
Break those down for us one more time. What does that actually look like in a post-collapse world?
Okay, so resilience, we've talked about that a lot. It's about being able to bounce back, both physically and emotionally, from whatever disruptions come our way. Relinquishment, that one's about letting go.
Letting go, like what?
Stuff, Things we don't need. Could be material possessions, could
Yeah.
be old ways of thinking, could be entire systems that just aren't working anymore.
Letting go of the things that are holding us back.
Exactly. And then restoration, that's about rebuilding, reviving ecosystems, communities, bringing back traditional knowledge that we've lost.
So taking what was broken and making it whole again.
And then finally, reconciliation. That's a big one. It's about owning up to the harm that's been done to each other and to the planet and finding ways to heal and move forward.
Finding forgiveness.
Forgiveness, understanding, compassion. It's about building a future together where everyone feels seen and heard and valued.
So it's about more than just surviving, it's about thriving. Creating a world that's better than what came before.
Exactly. And the really exciting thing is that there are people all over the world who are already doing this work. Welcome to the Great Unraveling. They call them positive deviants.
Positive deviants. I like that. Tell us more about them.
So these are individuals, communities, organizations. They're all out there creating these really cool solutions, demonstrating that another way is possible.
Do you have any examples? I mean, what does that even look like in the real world?
Think about the Transition Town movement. They're all about building local resilience, reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, or permaculture projects. They're showing us how to grow food in a way that actually regenerates the soil. There are community gardens popping up everywhere, local currency initiatives.
So even amidst all the doom and gloom, there's actually a lot of hope.
So much hope. And that's why Servigne is so adamant about getting involved. He says, find your thing, your passion, and go for it. Every little bit helps.
Even just talking about it, right? Like we're doing right now, just having these conversations can be revolutionary.
Absolutely, because the more we talk about it, the less scary it becomes. The more we normalize these conversations, the more we can start to imagine and create a different future.
And that brings us to something that both of these sources really emphasize.
Yeah.
We have to start questioning what we even mean by a good life.
Because right now we're told that a good life is all about money and status and buying a bunch of stuff.
And these sources are saying that's not just unsustainable, it's making us miserable.
Right, and it's keeping us distracted from what actually matters. Servigne, he talks about this in the interview. He says he's not interested in hoarding supplies or building a bunker. He'd rather spend his time connecting with his community, learning practical skills, building relationships.
He's focusing on the things that will matter no matter what the future holds.
Exactly, and I think that's a really powerful message for all of us. The future is uncertain, but that doesn't mean we have to live in fear. We can choose to focus on building a good life right now, today, based on values of connection, compassion, and resilience.
And that's something we can all get behind. So as we wrap up this deep dive into societal collapse and the potential for regeneration, I think the takeaway is this. The challenges are real, but so is our capacity for growth, adaptation, and incredible love.
It's about recognizing that even in the face of huge changes, we always have a choice. We can choose fear, or we can choose hope. We can choose to be divided, or we can choose to come together. We can choose to perpetuate the systems that are harming us, or we can choose to create something new.
We have the power to write the next chapter of the human story. And that's a powerful reminder as we navigate the uncertainty of the future.